Picture this. You are lying on a shelf of steel, barely wider than your shoulders. The man 6 inches above you is someone you've never met outside of this boat. The man below you is coughing. The air you're breathing has already been breathed by 50 other men, recycled through diesel engines and wet wool in bodies that haven't seen soap in 6 weeks. Somewhere in the darkness ahead of you, a pipe is weeping rust-colored water onto the floor. And then, cutting through the low hum of the electric motors, you hear it. A sound. Sharp, metallic, rhythmic. Ping, ping, ping. Every man in that boat goes completely still, because every man in that boat knows exactly what that sound means. Someone up there has found you. And now, in the cold dark beneath the Atlantic Ocean, all you can do is wait and pray that the next few minutes are not your last. This is what it meant to serve aboard a German U-boat in the Second World War. They were young, almost unbelievably young. The average U-boat crewman was 19 or 20 years old when he first climbed down into the hatch. Some were 17. Boys who had grown up landlocked in cities like Munich or Dresden, who had never so much as seen the ocean before the German Navy handed them a uniform and pointed them toward it. In the early war years, U-boat service was voluntary, and men actually competed for it. The pay was higher than standard military rates. The food was reputedly the finest in the Wehrmacht, and there was prestige in it. Submarine men were considered elite, a cut above the ordinary sailor. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander who built the U-boat arm almost from scratch, cultivated that identity deliberately. He greeted returning crews personally at the dock. He knew men by name. He built a culture of belonging that was rare in any military, let alone the German one. What those volunteers did not fully understand, could not have fully understood, was the arithmetic waiting for them. By the time the war ended, 3 out of every 4 men who served aboard a U-boat would be dead. Not missing, not prisoners, dead. It was the single highest casualty rate of any military branch on any side in the entire Second World War. The backbone of the German submarine fleet was the Type 7. Over 700 of them were constructed between 1936 and 1945, making it the most mass-produced submarine in the history of warfare. On paper, it was around 220 feet long. In practice, the space the crew actually occupied was something far smaller and far grimmer. The pressure hull, the sealed steel cylinder the men lived inside, was roughly the diameter of a garden shed, about 10 feet across at its widest. Now fill that space with 14 torpedoes, each one as long as a family car and weighing over 3,000 pounds. Add 2 diesel engines the size of small trucks, electric motors, banks of batteries, a radio room, a navigation station, and a galley kitchen so small that the cook had to turn sideways to pass through it. Then add 50 men. There were only 35 bunks, which meant that at any given moment, a third of the crew had nowhere to sleep but the floor, or the top of a torpedo tube, or a patch of deck between crates of canned goods. The practice was called hot bunking. When one man finished his sleep shift, another man climbed into the same bunk, still warm, still damp, still carrying the smell of the previous occupant. For the first 2 weeks of any patrol, the corridors were so packed with fresh food, sausages hanging from overhead pipes, bread wedged into every gap, vegetables stacked in nets, that the crew had to move through the boat hunched over like men walking through low caves. One veteran later wrote that boarding a U-boat felt less like going to war and more like being sealed inside a very noisy, very hostile closet. The captain had a curtain. That was his privacy. A single curtain. Ask any U-boat survivor what they remember most vividly, and the answer is rarely the explosions or the fear. It is the smell. Diesel fumes were omnipresent. The engines ran on the surface, and when they ran, The exhaust permeated every millimeter of the boat. The walls, the bunks, the food, the men themselves. Sailors called whatever the cook served diesel soupa, diesel soup, because regardless of the ingredients, every meal tasted of fuel. After a few weeks at sea, the men's noses simply stopped registering it. Their bodies had adapted to an environment no human being was ever designed to inhabit. Fresh water was rationed so severely that bathing was effectively impossible. The Navy issued each man cologne, not as a luxury, but as the closest available substitute for hygiene. It made no meaningful difference. Dock workers at the French bases in Lorient and Brest reportedly smelled a returning U-boat before they could see it. The stench that rolled off those crews was something people at the docks remembered for decades. The humidity inside the boat ran near 100%. Every surface wept condensation. Clothing never dried. Mold grew on anything organic. Bread, leather, the pages of the books men brought to pass the time. Skin infections were common, so were fungal conditions. The men were not filthy because they were careless. They were filthy because the machine they lived inside made cleanliness physically impossible. And layered beneath all of it was the boredom. The long, grinding, unrelenting boredom of open ocean transit. Days could pass without a single contact. Men played cards until the decks dissolved. A gramophone might play the same few scratched records so many times that a sailor could hear every pop and skip in his sleep. Some boats had a single book that was passed from bunk to bunk, read and reread until the spine crumbled. The boredom was not peaceful. It was the boredom of men who knew that at any second, without warning, everything could change. When a convoy was spotted, the transformation inside the boat was immediate and total. The exhausted, bored, unwashed men who had been sleeping in shifts became something else entirely. A precision machine. Every man moving to his station with the kind of automatic competence that only comes from drilling the same actions hundreds of times. The captain would maneuver the boat into attack position, usually at night on the surface, using the darkness as cover. The torpedo crews in the forward compartment would arm and flood the tubes. The commander would press his face to the attack periscope, calculating angles and speeds in his head, giving quiet commands. And then the compressed air would hiss, and the torpedo would leave the tube. And for the next few minutes, the boat would wait in absolute silence for either the dull crump of a detonation or the sickening silence of a miss. In the early war years, 1940 and 1941, the hunting was extraordinarily effective. The period became known among U-boat crews as die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Convoys were poorly defended. Allied anti-submarine tactics were underdeveloped. Some commanders sank hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping in a single patrol. But the happy time did not last. By 1942, and catastrophically by 1943, the equation had reversed. Allied scientists had cracked the Enigma cipher that protected German naval communications. New centimetric radar could locate a U-boat's periscope or conning tower from miles away in total darkness. Long-range aircraft began closing the gaps in mid-Atlantic air cover where U-boats had previously hunted without interference. Escort groups grew larger and learned to work together with lethal coordination. For the men inside the boats, the consequence was simple and devastating. They were no longer just hunters. They were prey. When a destroyer's sonar locked onto a submerged U-boat, the captain had one option: go deep, go quiet, and endure whatever came next. The diesel engines, which required air, shut down. The electric motors hummed at their lowest possible setting. Every non-essential system was powered off. Men were ordered to stop moving entirely. Some crews passed messages by hand signal to avoid even the sound of whispered voices. And then the depth charges came. A close detonation produced two sounds in rapid sequence. First, a sharp metallic crack as the pressure wave struck the hull. Then, a rolling, cavernous boom. The closer the charge, the shorter the gap between those two sounds. If they merged into one, the boat was likely already gone. During an attack, the boat would lurch and groan in ways its designers never intended. Gauges exploded from their mouths. Pipes burst. Unsecured tools and equipment became projectiles. Men were slammed into machinery. Cork insulation that lined the interior walls rained down in chunks. Light bulbs shattered, plunging the boat into darkness until someone could switch to the emergency red lights. And through all of it, there was nothing to do but endure it. A submerged U-boat in 1943 had no meaningful ability to strike back at a surface attacker. No countermeasures, no weapons that could reach upward. Only patience, silence, and luck. Some attacks lasted 20 minutes. Some lasted an entire day. The crew of one boat spent over 30 hours on the ocean floor, while destroyers circled overhead, methodically dropping charges at intervals designed to break nerves as much as hulls. Men sat with their backs against the cold steel walls and stared at nothing, listening to the sonar sweeping above them like a metronome counting down to something they couldn't name. A depth charge had to detonate within roughly 15 feet of the hull to guarantee a kill. Statistically, most attacks failed. But the men inside those boats had no access to statistics. Every explosion felt terminal. Every silent pause between charges felt like the universe deciding whether they deserved to keep breathing. Germany commissioned 1,162 U-boats over the course of the war. Of those, 784 were destroyed, sunk by depth charges, aircraft, mines, ramming, or accidents, a destruction rate exceeding 67%. Approximately 40,000 men served in the U-boat arm. Of those, around 28,000 were killed. Another 5,000 were taken prisoner. That means for every 10 men who volunteered for submarine duty, roughly 7.5 did not survive to see the armistice. By 1943, the average operational lifespan of a U-boat crew putting to sea was approximately 2 patrols. Dönitz knew the numbers. The crews knew the numbers. Some commanders later said the atmosphere in the bases in that final period was unlike anything else in military experience. Men going about their pre-patrol preparations with the quiet, methodical calm of people who had simply stopped believing they would return. And yet, the boats kept sailing. This is the question that historians and psychologists have turned over for 80 years without arriving at a clean answer. Part of it was duty, the kind that doesn't require belief in the cause, only in the obligation. Part of it was the bond that forms between men who have survived something unsurvivable together. When you have sat in the dark with another person while the ocean tried to crush you both, the idea of leaving him to do it without you becomes unthinkable. Part of it was the culture Dönitz had built, a genuine brotherhood, distinct from the rest of the German military, with its own traditions and its own pride. U-boat men wore their white, peaked caps at an angle that no regulation permitted and that no officer would correct. They considered themselves apart, and belonging to something, even something terrible, can be its own kind of anchor. But mostly, survivors say, it was fatalism. The decision, made quietly and never quite spoken aloud, to stop doing the math. Either you come back or you don't. You've done this before and you came back. Tomorrow is not today. They carried lucky charms. They developed rituals, a specific meal before sailing, a song, a word that had to be said before the hatch closed. They made black jokes that no one outside the boats could have understood. And they sailed. You can stand inside a U-boat today. The U-505, captured by the U.S. Navy in June 1944, sits in a climate-controlled hall at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Every valve, every bunk, every torpedo tube is intact. Visitors walk through it daily, and almost every one of them says the same thing when they emerge. I don't know how anyone lived like that. The honest answer is that most of them didn't. But for the men who did, for those who spent months sealed inside those machines, breathing diesel and listening for sonar, and playing the same card games and telling the same dark jokes while the Atlantic tried to swallow them whole, the U-boat was not just a weapon. It was a world. A brutal, airless, reeking, magnificent world. And the men who came home from it carried it with them for the rest of their lives, in the way they flinched at certain sounds, in the way they could never quite sleep in a quiet room, in the way they never, not once, complained about the smell of fresh air. If this video hit different, subscribe. There's a lot more where that came from.